So when we're talking about winter hardy small cereals, as you probably all know, we're really talking about cereal rye, winter wheat, and winter triticale. Another option for an overwintering annual would be hairy vetch. And we haven't talked a lot about hairy vetch yet, and there's kind of a reason for that. But again, remember that when we talk about annual forages and we're looking for forage productivity, grass is going to be king. And what we're really talking about is really thinking about planting in September, October, and maybe even early November for grazing in April, May, and you can even go into late June. I will point out two things here. One is that, of course, the earlier you plant, the greater biomass you get in the fall, which isn't going to be a lot. And you may not even get fall grazing, but you'll get earlier spring grazing with a little bit earlier planting. So like after corn silage is really nice because you get a really well-established winter hardy small cereals that then you can get on in early April, for instance. And sometimes people get on a little bit earlier, even in March, if they really got some good growth in the fall. Last year we planted about mid-October, and we were able to start grazing the 1st of April on some rye. It was Elbon rye, which comes out a little bit earlier in the spring than the northern rye. Okay, so let's talk just a second about hairy vetch, because I know people are really interested in adding legumes into the mix. The challenge with hairy vetch is that it can produce basically an immune response that shows up in the skin of cattle as well as causes some oral ulcers. There's a compound that it produces that some cattle basically react to. And so it's kind of, I call it Russian roulette, in that you don't really know whether your cattle are susceptible or not. And it seems like there are people who have used hairy vetch in the past, and then one year they have a problem. And I think it's because of the concentration of that compound for some reason was increased in the plant that particular year. So it is fairly low risk if it's immature. The higher in the maturity, the more of that compound we see, and it's very high in the seeds. And it's probably lower risk if it's in a small proportion of the diet. It's also not as high risk if it's hay or silage. But I think the point here is to recognize that there is a risk, and that management of your grazing would be even more important if you happen to put this in your mix, because you don't want to let it get mature. So I typically don't use it in my grazing systems just because I don't want to take on that risk. But it is probably one of the few winter hardy legumes that's fairly consistent about overwintering and growing in the spring. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the comparison of winter wheat, winter triticale, and cereal rye. And so what I'm going to show you is actually 3 years of a project where we were actually using these as cover crops in a soybean on soybean rotation, which I realize is a little odd. But there's a couple of reasons why we were doing that. We were working with ARS, and they were interested in soybeans on soybeans because, there's an interest in soybeans for biofuels. And winter hardy small cereals really work nicely both before and after soybeans. So soybean on soybean seems to make sense. And they were really interested in, how does this help the land, for instance, and can we get performance out of it in terms of getting some payback. And it made a really nice system. We did not fertilize with any nitrogen in this system over those 3 years. So what we did is we started grazing when the small cereals hit 5 inches. I know that if you look at most of the extension documents, they talk about waiting to 8 inches. I think that's too late. Small cereals grow really fast, and it's easy to get away from you. And the key is keeping them vegetative and immature. So we start at 5. That's mostly early April in almost every year. The latest would be, like the 10th of April for us in typical years, especially when we're planting this earlier. Like in this case, we're planting like mid to late September. We stocked with 2.5 to 3 growing calves, so steers per acre, and that's about 2,000 pounds is what we were shooting for, 2,000 pounds of body weight per acre. So if you kind of think about that, that's 1.25, 1.33 cow an acre, if you want to look at it that way. And then we tried to end grazing on or before May 10th. And that was just because this was a true cover crop situation, right? We're going to put in our cash crop. You can definitely graze later than that. This year, we're in an annual forage system. And so we're going to graze until the end of May. And the only reason we're ending at that point is because we want to get our warm season in. So recognize that, you know, if you're trying to use it as a cover crop, you're probably not going to use the full capacity of the small cereals. But you also don't necessarily have to pay for the land cost, right? And so there's always give and takes. And then lastly, I want to point out we did rotationally graze. It was just a 2-paddock rotation. And I will say I really think 3 or 4 paddocks is kind of ideal. But we had 9 groups of animals out there, and so splitting into 18 paddocks is probably the best we could do. So this is kind of what it looked like, and I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is on the one side is what we wanted it to look like when we were done grazing and we moved to the other side, which is what we want it to look like when we start grazing. And so this is kind of ideal. You do want to keep it in that vegetative state, and it is okay to graze it down fairly hard. You know, our target was like 2 inches of residual left. And this is how they performed. So in the red here, we have the cereal rye. In the gray, we have the triticale. And in the black, we have wheat. So the first year in 2020, you'll notice that the calves were a little lighter. And that's because they came off of stocks and they weren't supplemented as much on stocks. So this 4 pound a day gain looks amazing, right? But it's some compensatory growth. They grew a little better because we didn't push them very much during the winter. And while that sounds very appealing, I do want to point out that when we look at the economics of overwintering, remember you have some fixed costs associated with wintering those cattle. And in general, the economics look like you're much better off actually getting them to gain, you know, that 1.5 pounds a day and not having the compensatory growth than, you know, restricting their growth in the winter and counting on the compensatory growth, just FYI. The second year, you'll see that something else happened, right? The rye doesn't look like the wheat in triticale. And the performance was a little better on the rye, 2 pound a day gain versus a little over 0.5 pound a day gain for the triticale and wheat. And there's a couple things that are going on here. One of which is this was kind of a droughty year, but the big thing that was different was that we turned out and then we had a cold snap. And that with that cold snap, we had freezing weather. You know, the water tanks were getting iced over, and you could see that where the cattle were in the triticale and wheat, that they were damaging those plants by stepping on them when they were frozen. We really just didn't see that with the rye. This year, because it was a little bit droughty, we didn't have as good regrowth on any of the species. And so the amount of biomass out there was a little bit less as well. And I think that freezing weather set back our wheat and triticale just enough to where intake was probably being a little bit limited on those calves and not on the rye calves. And then the last year in 2022, 2 pound a day gain across the board, no differences. So basically, unless we kind of have that little bit of freezing weather situation, we really didn't see huge differences among the species. I should also point out that in 2020, that was the only year we turned out the rye about a week earlier than the other 2 species because it hit 5 inches a little bit sooner. But the rest of the years, they really came all about the same time. This was not a southern rye. Ryman rye, I believe, was the rye that was used in this grazing study. Okay, and also remember, this is just April to early May performance. I did want to point out the quality. This is just for the cereal rye, and I just really wanted to show you that. So DOM here, you can think TDN. I wanted to show you on average, it was 70 TDN. So amazingly high quality. And the crude protein was 22. The ranges here, even though, I mean, they're very, very good. So again, this stuff is more than adequate for an early lactation cow, for instance, or of course to grow calves. Calves, we use calves a lot just because the animal performance can tell us a lot about the quality. And when I talk about quality, I talk about really nutritive value and the intake that those animals will have and how grazing management might affect that animal performance. But this stuff is very good quality if you keep it in that vegetative state. Okay, so carrying capacity, we look at AUMs, so that's animal unit month. So it's 1,000-pound animal grazing for 1 month. Remember, we only allowed ourselves to graze to May 10th. In the first year, we had 2 AUMs. The second year, that was that kind of droughtier year, we only had 1. And then the third year, we had 1.5 AUMs. So in terms of AUMs per acre, 1.5 is probably a good assumption, at least in eastern Nebraska, about what we can get. This year, where we're actually going to go to the end of May, we're stocking at 0.75 cows an acre is where we started, and 1.5 calves an acre. And I will tell you that, interestingly, those really heavy bred cows that we put out that are calving right now on rye, they don't eat nearly as much as the growing calves are eating, probably because they have that big calf inside of them and just don't have as much room in the rumen. So we actually ended up taking one of our 4 paddocks out of the rotation. And what we're seeing is that we're really looking at about a cow an acre seems to be about right this year. So just to give you some ideas, we're still probably going to get about 3 AUMs an acre on average, especially with the growing calves. But I think it's important to kind of understand kind of where you think you can get to look at what the value of this is. So high quality forage, pretty good in terms of the grazing capacity. In terms of gain per acre, of course, compensatory gain, we got really great gain per acre, but 113 to 200 pounds per acre is what we can get on those growing calves. So that looks pretty good, to be honest. You might consider it even for like you're developing your replacement heifers, for instance. Or if you have stocker calves, it looks pretty good for stocker calves. Or you can use it, of course, for your lactating cows. The cost, though, is something to recognize. If you're using it as a true cover crop, right, and we don't have the land cost, there's not a whole lot of costs into this. I mean, we're looking at $40 to $45 an acre for the cereal rye and the wheat, and then about $60 for the triticale. Given the fact that triticale is more expensive, and if you're only using it as that cover crop and you're going to kill it fairly early, given the data we have, I can't say that I would spend the extra money on triticale. I can't tell you that things would be different if we were going later into the season, like grazing into June. Then I might change my mind, right, about triticale. But for just early grazing, I think cereal rye makes sense because it does have that little bit of more cold tolerance, and we can get on it earlier. In terms of cost per AUM, it ranged anywhere from $21 to $67 an AUM, and that 67 was that kind of drought year with the triticale. On average for cereal rye, we were looking at about $30 an AUM, which, just to give you some references here, for pasture rental rate in Nebraska, we're looking at about $64 an AUM. And for hay, we're looking at about $78 an AUM. So $30 looks pretty good. Now, if you're not using it just as a cover crop and you are going to put it in an annual forage rotation, then you also have to account for land costs. In our system with the warm seasons, we have about 2/5 of the AUMs that are coming off of the small cereal. So that's looking at probably, $20 to $30 that I need to add in cost. That would be just land cost on dry land in eastern Nebraska if I was going to rent it. But if I still add $20 or $30, I'm still looking relatively good relative to the AUMs for my pasture or my hay. So fairly cost effective. Probably not a home run in an annual forage system. Definitely, I would say a home run in a cover crop system. And then I do have the cost per pound of gain here. And I wanted to point out one thing about this, other than the fact that, we're looking at an average of about 80 cents when we're not looking at this compensatory gain situation. But I do have mineral cost on here. We did provide mineral. And I'm charging about 8 cents per day, which is, we were getting mineral for about $600 a ton. And I want to kind of point out that I do think mineral is useful. There's some data from more south, like Oklahoma, where they've looked at the performance of growing cattle on grazing small cereals, including rye. Most of their data is in wheat, but they do have some rye data. And there's a couple of things that I should point out. One of which is that adding a mineral improved the gain by about half a pound a day. About half of that response was just due to salt alone. So providing salt alone improved performance. And then the other thing that they did, they found that adding some magnesium improved performance of the growing calves. So couple things to understand is that in this case, if I think about a half a pound a day and I think about 8 cents, it is worth the cost of providing mineral to a growing calf out on the small cereals. If we look at lactating cows, I think it's even more important, mostly from the magnesium standpoint. So I have on here a lactating cow's requirement for calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, zinc and copper, which are the two most common trace minerals that are deficient. And I just wanted to show you a couple things because I think it's important to understand. The first one is that phosphorus looks pretty good. Okay, so we don't really need to be providing a lot of phosphorus, even for an early lactation cow, if they're grazing small cereal grains, which is good news because phosphorus is fairly expensive. However, if we look at magnesium, you might go, well, I mean, we're close here, even in wheat and triticale, and we're good on rye, even for a lactating cow. But you all know about grass tetany with the lush, cool season perennial pastures. Well, it's the same challenge with these small cereal pastures, and that is they are high in potassium. And I showed you the crude protein, which is high. It also means it's high in nitrogen, and high potassium and high nitrogen interfere with absorption of magnesium. And thus we do need to be providing a high magnesium mineral, both, in my opinion, to the lactating cows and to a growing calf. I think you see a response in growing calves in terms of performance. You're not going to have grass tetany in them. With a lactating cow, you could have grass tetany. So how do you overcome that? Feed a high mag mineral. Probably, a 6% magnesium mineral is sufficient, especially for the growing calves. And then lastly, I kind of have highlighted here the zinc and copper. And again, looking at the numbers, it looks like, oh, you should be fine. But I should point out that the bioavailability, or the amount of zinc and copper that's available to be absorbed by the animal, is probably on average about 50% from the forage. And so we're probably still a bit short, and I would suggest making sure you have zinc and copper in your mineral. Now, I was talking about the early season grazing and the key about keeping it vegetative. And this is the reason. If you look at the quality versus the yield, in the early vegetative states, it's higher quality. Yes, it is lower yielding, but when you're grazing and you're rotationally grazing, that's okay because you can keep it growing and you can still have, those high carrying capacities that I was talking about. And in fact, I actually suggest high stocking rates or high stocking densities, I guess I should say, because then it keeps those plants in the maturity states we're looking for, which is immature. Probably everybody has heard somebody or experienced themselves say, oh, well, that rye, it's low quality. And yes, it can be. If we look at these more mature states, the quality is much lower. And any of the small cereals will do this. In fact, any annual does this, right? They're very high quality early on, and as they get more mature, they're quite low quality. So the key is management to make sure that you're keeping it in that higher quality state to getting the performance you're looking for out of it. In fact, this is actually a picture from the same pastures years earlier. They were doing a study where they were looking at wheat, triticale, and rye, but they didn't start grazing really until the plant was at least 10 inches. So they were about a week to 2 weeks later than when we started grazing. They had similar stocking rates to what we did. And the other caveat is they did not rotationally graze. So they had access to the whole pasture for each of the groups. And the difference is kind of night and day in my mind, because in that situation, this is what it looked like when they were pulling off. Okay, so you can see it got mature and the cattle lost a half a pound a day. So yes, it is important that we keep it vegetative and that we manage it to keep it in that state. And the only way to do that is to have relatively high stocking densities. And it is so much easier if you have rotational grazing, because then you can graze it down and you can allow it to recover and get regrowth and then come back to it. So I really am a fan of 3 to 4 paddock rotation. And the advantage of that as well is if it does start getting away from you, you don't have enough cattle, for instance, because some years are better than others, you can just pull one of the paddocks out of that rotation. You decide to hay it or silage it or just kill it. And if you think about it on a bigger scale, you can do that from a field perspective. You might have 3 or 4 fields that are together, and you might pull one of the fields out, start planting it into your cash crop while you're grazing the others. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, but I think it's really important to make sure you're really on top of managing. And probably the hardest part of annual grazing is keeping it vegetative and keeping up with it, because it grows so fast. It's almost mind numbing. If you're used to perennials and you're a really good perennial manager, it's somewhat hard to manage annuals because you tend to want to be conservative in your grazing. And I think you have to be much more severe to keep up with it. So this is actually a picture of kind of an extreme, but this is what a field looked like when we were done grazing. It was over a weekend, and this was on 4/21. I had looked at it on Friday and said, oh, it'll be fine until Monday. And then this is what it looked like on Monday. But this is what it looked like 6 days later. And so again, it just grows so rapidly and it recovers quite well. So this is just to understand, like, you can make these mistakes. I'm not suggesting you do, but you can make these mistakes and it recovers. It is quite different of a beast, I guess I would say. Annuals they're different. They grow really fast. And then this is 4/27. I told you we pulled off, May 10th. And then we got some rain. This is a picture where we had pulled off, and then this is what it looked like 10 days later. And so again, I just want to point out that they grow very fast, and that early May period is not like by any means where the performance of these crops are really declining. I mean, they are still growing quite rapidly during that time. So if you are in an annual forage system, you can definitely graze longer than that early May. And you can still have quite a bit of performance. As I said, we're looking at continuing to graze into, you know, late May, and the quality still seems to maintain. Okay, so James asked what the planting population was and how much fertilizer. So again, it's not fertilized at all. It was just soybean on soybean. So it's whatever the soybeans are providing. And then this is the seeding rates that we did. We were looking to have the similar pure live seed. So that's why these seeding rates are a little bit different. Our suggestion typically is like on cereal rye, it's 70 to 90 pounds. Cereal, like the Elbon rye is a little bit smaller seed, and so 70 pounds is probably enough. And then the same thing on wheat and triticale. We usually have similar suggestions for seeding rates. So no fertilizer in this particular case. I will tell you that, like, if I'm in an annual forage rotation, or if I'm like after corn or something, I'm probably going to suggest putting on 40 pounds in the fall. This year, actually, I messed up and forgot to put on nitrogen in the fall. And so we put on some this spring because the plants, the rye was looking a little yellow and kind of slowing down and lagging. And I will tell you that the tillering that we have seen from putting on that nitrogen tells me that it was well worth the putting on the 40 pounds in. Okay, so keys to managing small cereals: start early. When you think it's ready, it's probably ready. When you think it's going to be ready in a week, it's probably ready. Get on it early. Start out, half a cow to 1 cow an acre. And that depends on how much moisture you think you're going to get. If you have enough moisture, I think a cow an acre is very reasonable. One of the things you might have to do, especially if you're grazing later into May, is that you may have to increase the stocking density, which means you may want to pull some of the land out of your rotation because it can start getting away from you. At the same stocking density that you had very early in the spring, because really cool conditions is not growing quite as fast, and then we get a little bit warmer, it can really take off. Use rotational grazing. Make sure that you do have high enough stocking density to manage that maturity. Try to keep it uniform and reduce selectivity, because you will keep those plants growing that way, and you'll also keep the quality higher. And probably one of the things that, just like with perennials, is like looking ahead and saying, well, there's still more to use where I'm at, but this one's starting to get away from me. Maybe I'm just going to move to that one to get it mowed down a little bit so it doesn't continue to get too mature. So look ahead and manage based off of what the rest of the pasture looks like. Last thing I really wanted to show you is that I do think there's not a lot of varieties, named varieties of cereal rye out there. That's one thing I hope that will change in the future. But this is Elbon, which is a southern rye, and southern ryes come out of dormancy a little bit earlier than northern ryes. Now, this is a variety non-stated. I'm going to assume it's a northern rye. That's what we kind of tend to get here, but these were planted on the same date, and it was actually mid-September because it was a prevent plant. So that's why there's so much growth here in early April, and it was far southeast Nebraska. But I wanted to show you the difference just in how much growth and the maturity of these two. Elbon comes out earlier, which means it's going to be at a different stage of maturity at the same relative time. I don't think it actually matures more quickly. It's just because it started earlier. And we have gotten really good performance on Elbon, similar to what we've gotten on northern ryes or on the wheat and triticale. And so I really kind of like it, because if I can get on a week earlier, in that early April period, that's worth it to me, because if I don't have to feed hay, I'm all for it. So it might be something worth considering.